Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, 8 Steps to Leading Safety Culture Transformation. My name is Cassie Bolter and I'm the Events and Partnership Manager at Centus. Today's presenter is CEO for Centus, Anthony Gibbs. Anthony has worked with thousands of people across hundreds of organisations globally to develop safety culture solutions. Thanks again for joining us. I'll now pass over to Anthony.
Thank you, Cassie, and great to have everyone on board for this really important topic and conversation. Before we launch into the meaty stuff, wanted to take a quick opportunity to do some acknowledgement of country. So Centus acknowledges the traditional custodians throughout Australia and recognises their connections to the land, waters and community. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past and present. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. We do this because we value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture, and knowledge. For those of you who aren't familiar with Centus, we are a psychology and neuropsychology-based businesses that focuses on changing individuals and organisations' lives for the better every day through safety culture transformation projects. So we offer extensive services in cultural diagnostic and assessments. We do leadership and team development. We provide services in the area of humanising critical risk and critical controls. And we also have a strong lens on psychosocial safety. And you'll see an upcoming webinar from us on said topic. In today's webinar, we're going to cover off this fairly meaty concept of how you create safety culture transformation in 4 high-level steps. Firstly, we're going to explore briefly why projects fail. So hopefully I'm not going to bring up any old traumas for anyone on the call. We're going to look at what high-performing organisations focus on to be able to effectively execute on the transformation process. We'll then dive into the 8 steps for effective change, and we'll talk to you a little bit about where to start. So let's have a quick chat firstly about what happens if we don't get safety culture transformation right. And if we don't get safety culture right. Now, the interesting thing is I see a lot of organisations, we see a lot of organisations wanting to transform their culture, but not necessarily putting the time and planning into doing that in an effective way. And the challenge is every time you have a crack at transforming safety culture and you don't do it effectively, or you don't follow through on the commitments that you've been made, you actually have the potential not only to not achieve the objective that you set out to achieve, but you can actually unravel some of the work that you've done previously and have quite a negative impact. The reason we can see that negative impact is you can find that organizations can have their credibility impacted by failing to execute effectively. So you get that language from the workforce of it's just another initiative, it's just another sugar hit, and you get that bit of an ostrich in the sand kind of approach where people shove their heads in and just wait for this to blow over and the next little fad to come through. Internal context is damaged. So what we mean by internal context is people's perception of how change is managed and communicated can be damaged. And this has big implications for how seriously people take leadership communication and decisions. And you miss some really great opportunities by not executing this effectively. One is around using safety as a common good. So the one thing about safety is it's a fairly strong universal. It's an assumption that you can make that most people don't go to work to get hurt. So actually by creating by creating cultural change projects that anchor on safety, you've actually got an opportunity to align people around that common good of safety. You've got an ability for leaders to demonstrate active care around something that's quite tangible, and you're able to increase your likelihood of being able to get reciprocity from the workforce. And finally, if you execute this right, you can lift the brand of the business and the leadership team. You don't get it right, then the brand of safety can get damaged overall. So as I mentioned before, if you don't design your culture, you get whatever culture you're going to get. And where we find a lot of organizations engaging with this is on the left-hand side of this maturity model. So the left-hand side of this maturity model reflects cultures that sit in counterproductivity up until midway through the public compliance space. And these are cultures which are largely made up of sort of a blame, avoidance, sort of unhelpful frame around safety and commitment to safety. So it's that kind of culture where you try and roll out an initiative or you try and engage with the workforce and you're getting that resistance, either overt or subversive. What organizations are typically trying to achieve is a flip over to this ownership culture where you've got leaders and team members and everyone within the organization taking greater ownership and responsibility. They're taking control of what they can control. They're accountable and they're solution focused. And you can see down there, one refers to a culture which is predominantly externally locused and one which is predominantly internally locused. Now, the challenge is with cultures and with organizations is if you don't design that culture, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to get whatever culture you're going to get. And the chances are it's not going to be what you want. So what we know about humans and by human natures is not every human will typically take responsibility for when things are hard and when things go wrong, particularly if they don't feel a sense of connection to the vision and to the strategy and to the leadership and to the organization as a whole. So when those relationships break down, and you don't have people with that connection to the vision and the leadership and the strategy of the business, you tend to get those left-hand side red zone behaviors. So what we're seeing is that unless you're very clear about mapping a transformation process and sustaining a transformation process, you're going to get those red zone behaviors. But if you flip over to that green zone, you've actually got some really great opportunities to improve psychological, physical and social safety, and also create a byproduct of a more productive, more engaged workforce. So I've been keeping a note over the last 15 years of some of the reasons I've seen some projects go not so well. And we've in past webinars, we've had some people share some examples. So if you've got some shared trauma you'd like to put in the chat about why you've seen culture change projects fail, feel free to put it in the chat so we can all reminisce together. But some of the ones that we've identified in terms of why change projects have failed is firstly a failure to align the project with the organizational strategy. So where we see safety culture transformation projects go not so well is that safety is seen as an add-on or an adjunct thing to the overall organizational strategy. So the effort hasn't been made to look at, well, how does this achieving in the safety and the safety culture space actually achieve our broader organizational strategy? So what happens if we're not creating that connection point is that strategy loses momentum and starts to become perceived as a cost over time as it links to the next element down below. If the strategy itself isn't seen as an enabler of the organization's strategy, and whether it be a people strategy or a commercial strategy, it will quickly become a cost. So we need to be really careful about thinking about how does investing in this safety culture transformation project help us have a better business. The other challenge that we'll see organizations often engage in is our rush to action. So there might be a spate of incidents, maybe some attention from the regulator, maybe the board applies some pressure for whatever reason, and there seems to be this desire just to do something, to be seen as taking action. And the risk with that is you can actually not do the right thing, or you can engage in behaviours which actually aren't sustainable in the long term. So we often encourage organisations to go slow to go fast and think very carefully about where they invest their time, money, effort, and energy. The rush to action often involves also not involving key stakeholder support. So when we talk about key stakeholder support, and we're going to cover this off a little bit later, who are the key influencers within the business that we need to engage with to ensure that this is effective? Again, some more planning challenges that we see come up are a lack of having a clear vision and roadmap for change, key stakeholders moving on. So maybe even if a steering committee has been set up, a failure to replace members as they move on. So we can find that there's no one left who owns a project. There can be impatience with the speed of change, and this is often a measurement issue. So this comes down to not setting short, medium, and long-term goals and tracking them over time. And finally, one of the big challenges we see is the safety challenge is solved. So whatever performance metrics have improved, and then something else is on fire within the organisation, and the focus shifts on to whatever that is. And as a result, perhaps that safety project or that safety initiative gets put on the back burner 2 or 3 years later. That hasn't been maintained, and people end up back where they started. So thinking about how we can maintain a constant focus and a sustainable level of focus on whatever initiative is really, really critical. And you see, I guess, yeah, this play out in a number of ways within organizations. So as you're aware, I guess anyone who's viewed us before, or if you're new, this will be new information to you. We do at Centis a lot of studies. So we've had the opportunity to work with multiple organizations across the globe. And one of the things that they often will use us for is to help them understand what are the drivers of the current safety culture that they've got in place. So this particular bit of information comes from our Driving a Positive Safety Culture report, which can be found on our website quite easily. And what it refers to is, what are the top 5 opportunity areas of organizations that sit in that red zone culture, that less mature stage of cultural maturity? And what this basically says is that these organizations tend to have people reporting these issues over and over and over again as being some of the key opportunity areas that they need to address in order to progress forward as an organization. So you'll see quality of safety procedures. So in these organizations, we tend to see that safety incidents or safety issues are responded to by more paperwork, which actually flicks down to internal context and links to internal context fairly closely, because internal context talks about change management and internal engagement and consultation and collaboration. We see a perception that there is a poor level of management safety commitment. So this is a perception that leaders don't walk the talk. There's a perception that safety matters when it matters, but it doesn't when it doesn't. So perhaps, day to day, it might matter a lot that you're wearing your safety glasses as that site manager is walking around doing a tour, but you got to shut down on, or you got to break down. You need to get some equipment back online because it's costing money. Those rules go out at the door. Then you've got a byproduct that seems to come out of this, which is willingness to report incidents and errors. And in these organizations, there's a real perception that if you report, there's a real desire, or there's a real perception that you can't report incident and errors for a number of different reasons. And some of the key drivers of that are, if I report the incident and error, I'll get the blame for whatever the issue is. The second one is that the policies and procedures are too hard to engage with, so therefore the reporting process is too difficult, so they don't bother. Or the third one is, even if I report it, nothing's done. So if it needs to be fixed, I might as well just fix it myself. So you're not getting that benefit of that data because there's a perception of inaction by management, or if there is an action, it's probably just another policy procedure that's deployed and rolled out. And then finally, you get this perception of the workforce that their contributions to safety aren't valued. So this is employee safety performance. So employee safety performance relates to that whole idea that I'm recognized for good work as well as when things aren't going to plan as well. So you typically see in organizations like this one, who sit at this level of maturity, in a whole range of employees out there going, you know what, I work safely 99.9% of the time. I hear nothing. I don't hear boo from a grasshopper around the safety commitments and energy that I'm putting in. But if something goes not to plan, look out. I've got instant investigations. I've got people talking to me. I've got getting hauled into meetings. I'm getting made an example of in pre-starts, whatever the case may be. So all of these things, as you can see, can really start to compound. And once you get caught in this negative cycle, it's very difficult, unless you take very clear and deliberate action to address these issues, to actually snap out of this, because you've got frames reinforcing frames reinforcing frames, and you end up spinning in this circle. And this is where we see leaderships and organizations get really frustrated, because they just can't break that cycle with their workforce. So why is it so difficult to get this change happening from a brain perspective? Well, a little bit of brain science for those of you who are interested in this take on things. So what we know about the brain and the way that we process our environment is that every moment in time, we are bombarded with millions of bits of information. So information through all of our five senses is getting hammered into our brain. Now, it is impossible for our brain to process all of that information and make sense of it. In fact, if we tried to do that, we'd probably go a little bit insane. So our brain has adapted to create mechanisms to process that information and prioritize that information. And the way it filters and prioritizes that information is through a sorting process called DIPI. Dangerous, important, pleasurable, and interesting information is attended to, and our brain processes it. Now, a lot of the information that is processed when it comes to the workplace or in life, like the danger and the important is the most likely to draw our attention to it. It's what is highlighted within our brains. Now, this is good news because obviously our brains are wired to look for hazards, to look for risks, or to look for threats. But in cultures like the ones that we just shared before, the actual hazards in the environment become less of a threat to people, and the safety rules and policies and procedures and governance becomes more of a threat than the safety issues themselves, because our brain will register physical and social threat in very similar ways. So we've managed to take something like safety, which is a universal in a lot of organizations, something that everyone should care about and connect with. It's part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we've actually managed to turn that into a threat. So when we try and roll out these safety procedures, these new guidelines, these new way of doing things, all within positive intent, the initial response to these initiatives when they're deployed is often a threat response. Oh, here we go again. How are they going to use this to catch me out? Another backside covering exercise by management. These are the sorts of red frames we may be dealing with as we deploy these initiatives. So what does it look like to do change processes better? What are the higher performing organizations doing, which is able to get them out of that red zone culture and into more of a green zone helpful culture? Well, in a surprise to probably no one, since I set this up, we've got some research that gives us some evidence about what these organizations are doing. What these organizations are doing is firstly creating a common North Star, a mission and a vision, and often a set of values that comes off that safety mission and vision that people can align to and connect to. It needs to be one that has a very strong why behind it, and the why needs to be one that isn't about reducing LTIs for the commercial blah 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 of the business. It needs to be a safety mission and vision which demonstrates care and commitment to the safety of the people in the organization, and maybe even the public as well, if there's any interplay with the public. Once we've got those safety mission and vision in place, once we've got those values in place, what we see these organizations doing is investing in their leaders. They're going, right, the people who are going to carry this message to the workforce and create a sustained messaging, and the people who are going to match the language with the behaviors are actually the leaders in the business. So in these organizations, they've invested in their leaders, and as a result, the perceptions of management safety commitment are much, much stronger. The next element of this is all about communication. In these organizations, there's been considerable effort put into learning from not only issues and errors that arrive, but learnings and innovations that occur. So you see increased within team communication, increased active care for one another. Are people within the organization more willing to challenge each other to make sure you're keeping each other safe? You see a byproduct here of increased personal responsibility for safety. So in these organizations, people tend to say, well, I have a 50% or I have a portion of responsibility when it comes to safety, where perhaps in those red zone cultures, there's a lot more pointing towards poor policies and procedures. And then finally, what we tend to see here is an improved or increased team support for safety. So what that can, how that can play out is perhaps reduced resistance to change, but it can also play out in the form of initiatives and ideas bubbling up from the workforce and being heard by safety leaders and actually having that more ground up engagement in safety, which is, when you really know you're starting to have a win is when your team members are looking out for one another and thinking about, is there a better and safer way to get this work done? So that's a little bit about why things fail, and I guess the high level about what higher performing organizations are doing versus the ones who are perhaps struggling a bit. But let's talk a little bit more about some of the, I guess, specifics about how we can go about tackling this transformation process. I've just got a comment in here from Stephen. Number one on your list, not aligned with the organisation strategy is the one key learning for me. Thinking of a project I would try and forget in 2008. Stephen, you are not alone. You're not Robinson Crusoe in that regard. And I think a lot of us have experienced that same challenge. So what we've done and what we've anchored this particular change process on is an adapted version of Kotter's 8 steps for safety culture change. It's based on Kotter's stuff, but we've tweaked it and adjusted it based on some of the experience that we've had working specifically with organizations around safety culture change. So the steps that you can see here are probably familiar to a lot of you: create urgency, build a powerful coalition, create a vision for change, communicate the vision, empower broad-based action, create short-term wins, build on change, and anchor the changes. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time just digging into each of these, so we can share a couple of our learnings that we've been able to pick up from the multitude of organizations that we've worked with. And one of the benefits of being a consultant and doing what I do is I get to learn from lots of smart people every day. So this is a great opportunity for me to share some unoriginal thoughts from other people that I've collected over the years. So firstly, let's talk about creating urgency. So often the thought about creating urgency is about creating a sense of crisis within organizations. And that tends to be a big driver for organizations. Like the move away from pain from a social brand perspective is often a much more powerful driver. But I really challenge you to not only think about the moving away from pain piece, but also what's the opportunity that comes out of this change. And I think a good thing to think about in relation to this is the new legislation around psychosocial risk. We're seeing a lot of organizations really panicking and looking at, well, how do we address each element of the legislation that's been deployed? They're moving away from crisis because they're going, well, we've got a big problem to solve. I think there's an opportunity to flip the conversation on its head and say, well, if we're able to meet these conditions, if we're able to make our workplace a much better place to work, what are the benefits? What are the opportunities we can gain out of getting this to work properly? How would this enable us to achieve our strategy more effectively? And by thinking, I think, about challenges in this way, both as what's the pain we're moving away from and what's the gain we're moving towards, it actually gives us some different lenses and some different views on which to engage with stakeholders. Because some stakeholders are going to care about one aspect, and some stakeholders are going to care about the other. So by looking at it through both those lenses, and there's probably more lenses you can put on it as well, you've got that opportunity to engage people better. And then finally, look at how you can get credible and compelling data to support whatever that change is that you're trying to create. And that data might not even be all data that you've been able to collect within your organization. It might be case studies or examples or scenarios from other organizations who are experiencing similar or the same challenges as you. It might even involve getting in some of those people to share their learnings and reflections and talk about their benefits. But again, spending some time to essentially think about, well, what is my business case? And how does this, again, align to that overall business strategy? This is often an underbaked element of how organizations go about tackling this. Once we've been able to put together this bit of a business case, for lack of a better term, think about who you need in the organization to leverage to be able to effectively influence the change that you want to see. Think about the leaders that you think are friendlies for what you're trying to achieve. Think about the leaders who are aligned to the objectives and engage them as individuals firstly. Spend some time getting to know them, what matters to them, what drives to them, what aspect of the change they're most committed to and interested in engage with. And then use this team as the vehicle to help you understand and overcome roadblocks. And look, these influential leaders may not be executives. They may be executives, and hopefully you want some executive sponsorship in there, but it actually could be a mix and a slice throughout the organizations of sort of people in official leadership roles, but also unofficial leadership roles, influencers. Might even also be union reps or safety reps, people who have a strong sphere of influence and strong credibility within the business. And then don't leave things up to chance. What we'd then be suggesting is, once you've got this guiding coalition up, once you've got the pitch that you want to take to the workforce, set a meeting rhythm, track it with notes, and use this group to help deploy the vision for change. What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to achieve? What's it going to look like to succeed? Drive it, drive it, drive it, drive it, drive it. And this, again, feeds in this idea of create a vision for change. Now, a vision for change, there'll be an inspiring tagline, but we actually want to be able to get into the detail and show that we're backing up what we're saying with something, with a plan, essentially. Because there's lots of visions that I've seen stuck on walls of organizations, but because there was no plan to execute on that vision, it fades into the background and people don't even see it anymore. So think about the what, the why, and the how for the change. Think practically about execution, document the vision and the supporting strategy with the plan. Get it in writing, and then think about an abbreviated version of that you can comms to the business with dates, times, and commitments. So the tool that we use when we work with organizations looks a bit like this, but essentially what you're looking at here is you've got current strengths, current opportunities up the top there, a bit of a vision for where we want the business to be, some strategic priorities, 3-year objectives, annual priorities, quarterly actions, who's responsible, where, and then comments. And then you've got how will we communicate the strategy, how will we celebrate successes, and then we've got some metrics that we want to move. So what we see the best performing organizations doing is actually documenting, hey, these are our 4 strategic priorities based on whatever data we've been able to collect. This is where we want to see the business in 3 years. This is where we want to get to over the year. And this is what we're going to do this quarter to move the dial, inch by inch by inch by inch. And we'll know we're succeeding via these metrics. Document that, synthesize it, and then come up with a communication plan to report that back to your broader leadership group, but also your business. So really, really important aspect. You don't have to use this document. There's lots of different versions of it around. This is just a version that we use. But having a documented piece of information like that, again, enables you to address the items that have been identified here. So it enables us to speak clearly about not only what the vision is, but how we're going to go about achieving it, how success will be measured, what the deployment structure and timelines will look like, who will be responsible. And it also enables us, if we're going to see a little bit later on, to celebrate successes as we tick off items of this process. By the way, these slides will be provided at the end of this webinar if you want to get into the detail. Step 5, empower broad-based action. So look to incorporate reinforcing nudges and behaviors in operations, business through the integration into existing meetings, existing training, existing processes. So we see organizations want to deploy these new strategies, and with these new strategies, there often comes a whole lot of additional work and rigor. We're going to add this, we're going to add this, we're going to add this. Where possible, we really encourage organizations to focus on quality and not quantity. Look at the existing mechanisms that you have to engage your workforce and leverage those as much as possible. Look at things like your pre-starts, your in-field interactions, your critical risk framework, your induction, whatever the element may be. How do we anchor upon that? Yep, you might have to do some training or some specific activities to get the momentum and the language up and running. But beyond that, it's about how do we weave this into the DNA of the business so it becomes BAU. Now, again, this comes back to the planning phase a little bit. Often organizations will sort of launch into some sort of diagnostic process or want to launch into that and then want to train their leaders and do a whole lot of activities. And then it'll be, well, we'll think about how we're going to sustain this and we're going to embed it into operations later on down the track. Our encouragement would be to think about that all up front. Because if you think about that all up front, then the way you design the initial initiative can actually talk to that throughout. If you're doing a training program, whatever the initial process is, you can actually have all of that weaved within the process. And it just makes the whole integration process and the story run a whole lot smoother. So again, it takes a little bit more time and effort up front, but there's some significant downstream effects that can create, which are really, really positive. Number 6, create short-term wins. Now, this is what I sort of referenced before. If you're setting those metrics up, because culture change can be slow, because you're sort of working people through a process, it's not like, hey, I'll put up that guardrail, you can see it, it's tangible, hooray, the thing is built. You're actually shifting a collective set of mindsets over time towards a common and aligned set of expectations and a cultural transformation. So thinking about how do we provide evidence to the business that what we're doing is winning and succeeding is really, really important. So what that can look like is some of the following. Let's say, as part of your planning and discovery process, you identify that there's maybe some safety clutter that needs to be removed, or some processes that need to be adjusted, or some workforce consultation that needs to be completed, whatever the case may be. That might be entered as a task on that particular document. And again, if you've got your comms strategy right, you've comms this out to the business already. You've said, all right, you've told us that these are the issues and this is what we intend to do about it. When you get to the end of that quarter and you've completed it, scream it from the rafters. If you've committed to a thing, you've done a thing, you've addressed a thing, let the workforce know. Get their feedback. How effective do you think the new process is? Continue the conversation around, because if you don't communicate it, it'll just fade into the background as a new way of doing things. And you haven't had that opportunity for people to stop and reflect about the positive progress which has been made. Pulse surveys can be another way. If you want to sort of understand what the collective mood and attitude and climate of the business is, pulse surveys can give you a good hint on that. Targeted lead indicator improvements, so things like critical control verifications, or different sorts of practical, tangible, measurable activities which show the presence of safety as opposed to the absence of harm, are really useful, and something we'd be encouraging you to set up at the front and measure and track success and performance. An example of this that organizations often get confused about is increases in near-miss reporting. So a byproduct of often getting greater cultural engagement is you actually will initially often get an increase in incidents and also get an increase in near-miss reporting. Now, ideally, what you will start to see is you'll start to see the near-miss, the incident dropping off and the near-miss reporting continue to increase. However, that can be quite off-putting for leaders when they're reporting that, because all of a sudden it feels like there's a whole lot more safety issues occurring within the business. Again, getting clear, that's not the case. It's the case that you're just hearing more about it, and that's good news. That's excellent that you're doing that. That's an important thing to get aligned around. And look, finally, some really useful things to share are employee and leadership testimonials. Hearing from other leaders and other team members in the business to say, hey, we've noticed a change, we've experienced a change, this is how it's benefited on me in a positive way. These are fantastic things. So sharing those and getting people to share those positive experiences is also a really useful strategy. Number 7 is build on change. They say that success breeds success. So once you've got a few wins up and running, once you're starting to get things moving off, sometimes organizations will declare victory too early. So they'll drop it and they'll move on to whatever the next thing is to focus on. What we'd be encouraging you to do is, once you've got your sort of foundation set, start thinking broader about how do we continue to evolve our culture in a positive way. So, you might ask yourself about, do we need to think about our hiring processes? Do we need to think about the types of leaders we're promoting and how we develop them? What are some of the other ways that we haven't considered that can help us to continue to positively improve our culture? You might go in, you might have a look at things like complex systems and structures and policies that don't fit together. You might have a look at some of your more technical safety elements, like your critical control frameworks and different things like that. Really starting to get under the hood and saying, well, how do we add value to the things that we're already doing so that it becomes a self-reinforcing process? And look, if you get stuck on knowing what the best thing to focus on next, a really good way to know where to focus is to ask your workforce. They'll have a really good sense of what the opportunities to continue to build on the change are. So treating them, again, as an army of problem solvers as opposed to an army of problems. And then finally, anchor the changes. So it's really important that once we've got this in the business, we anchor it into the way that we do things around here. So some examples that we've seen organizations do really well is performance metrics from the board down, team and leader performance plans, so integration of some of these key focuses into that, restructuring your reward and recognition programs. You'd be surprised how many organizations still provide bonuses on lost time injury frequency rates and things that actually can be counterproductive to safety culture results. Pre-starts, in-field interactions, critical control frameworks, contract manager. There's actually opportunities within each of these to look at how you can use them to create more positive safety cultures. If I jump into the critical control frames a little bit, because that's been a space where we've had a lot of organizations working with us recently. There's a big opportunity for a lot of organizations in their serious injury or critical control frameworks, because what we're seeing start to happen is there'll be some challenges play out. One is organizations won't have a clear understanding about the difference between severity and potential. If they do have an understanding about the difference between severity and potential, they're not always categorizing that information right, which impacts on their decision making. We're finding that some of the controls that are put in place around these frameworks also are inadequate, and the workforce hasn't been engaged with them. And we're also finding a lot of workforces that actually haven't been trained in what those adequate controls can look like. So they're on the wall or on the shelf somewhere, but they haven't been deployed. So there's a whole lot of elements to that where you can actually use a mechanism like that, which is critical and core to the safety of a business, and you can actually use that as an engagement tool to engage with leaders, to get teams having better quality interactions in the field, to lift the culture. You know, those sorts of tools done effectively can actually lift a culture and progress things forward. But again, getting a clear plan about which of these to attack and in which order, and doing that planning work right up front is one of the really valuable lessons that we've learned. So key takeaways for consideration, and then we're going to create some space for people to ask some questions. We've had some questions sent in beforehand as well. So if you've got some questions, feel free to start placing them in the chat or in the Q&A whenever you like. But some of the key takeaways to consider. Firstly, as I've probably spoken about a lot, cultural change requires careful planning and consideration. Measure twice, cut once, you know, all those kind of analogies. Think about what you're trying to achieve, why you're trying to achieve it, how you're trying to achieve it. Go slow to go fast. It'll be tempting to cut steps in the process, you know, not consulting with the workforce, or, you know, moving things along at a quicker rate because you got that sense of urgency. But if you cut the corners, you end up paying the price later on. You'll end up investing the time in a reactive way or a proactive way, and it's your choice as to how you want to go about that. As I mentioned, go slow to go fast in the 8 steps, and then take the time to map out how you'll bring this program to life and map it out against the 8 stages. So actually sit down. My encouragement would be to sit down and map it against those 8 stages and think about, all right, well, what does it look like? What are the key activities against each of those pieces? And engage a broader group to support you in that would also be my encouragement. So some consideration. So I'll open the floor up to some Q&As, and I've got one that's come through from Pam, I can see, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Just while we're waiting for some more questions to come in, if this is an area that you would like some additional support on, we are running our second masterclass on being a safety culture change agent starting on the 13th of March in 2023. It's a 12-week online course that has a combination of self-paced learning, videos, activities, resources, a lot of the information that we've spoken about today, as well as live Q&A sessions with a range of our experts. Now, the benefits that we've seen out of running this process is we will have numerous people from a multitude of organizations. I think we had about 80 people in the last round from 11 different countries and a range of different industries who were all coming together to think about how they could create change within their own individual organizations. And it created some really rich learning. Obviously, we believe we've created some value in that space, but the real rich learning also came between different organizations and those connections that were made. If this is an area that you think this is a course or something that you think you might be interested in investing in or exploring a little bit more, there's a poll up on the screen. Click yes, and we'll collect your details, and one of our team members will be in touch with you to check in and see what you're trying to achieve and see if the course is a good match for you. Obviously, feel free to click no if it's not for you right at this minute. Okay, while I got that poll open, I will I'll start to answer some questions. Can you share more research around why not to have LTI in your recognition scorecards, etc.? I'd love to have some third-party data to share with our leaders on the topic. Yeah, I can dig up some stuff for you, Pam. The main driver or the main concern with the not having LTIs as part of your reward and recognition process is that it's got some unwanted consequences, and the unwanted consequences are that it tends to drive higher levels of underreporting within an organization, because people have got commercial I guess incentives tied to those LTIs. You know, imagine being the person who's just been involved in the incident, and that incident is standing between everyone in the organization getting an incentive or not. So that is the big challenge that comes out of it. The other sort of element that comes out of it is you can see people manipulating incident and injury data to try and get those results. You can also, there's a whole raft of other challenges in there. I can dig something up and send it through to you, Pam, not a problem. I got a comment from Eric, influencing a corporate safety team who have their own apparent agenda and priorities. So how do we influence a corporate safety team who have their own apparent agenda and priorities, I think is the question. I think, Eric, it's a very tricky one. I think in those circumstances, you do need some support either from the board or from the CEO in that process. And I guess thinking about what's going on in the business and how it's impacting on their ability to achieve what they're trying to achieve, thinking what matters to them. And so when it comes to starting to engage what could be a political kind of organization and situation, spending some time with individual leaders, asking them questions, seeking to understand their perspectives and frames on things, unpacking that information is probably a good place to start. And then anchoring in on the people who are your most likely supporters. I think some of the challenges when you're trying to create this change, particularly at a corporate level, is it's often the loudest and the squeakiest wheels in the room that can steal most of our cognitive energy and attention, and probably drive a lot of our frustration. My encouragement would be find the people in the room who are aligned, who want to get a positive outcome, and see how you can work through them. Start to work on your strengths as opposed to focusing on the weaknesses. Get advice, get guidance from them, and start to build that momentum. Escalating information to the board is also another pretty important and critical thing here. And you do have some mechanisms to do that, I think, around critical control frameworks, and the psychosocial risk legislation is just coming out as well, and making sure that they feel like those risks are managed and governed effectively. So yeah, it's a tricky one, Eric, but I hope there's some hints in there that can potentially help. Cassie, I think we had some questions come through prior to the session as well.
Yeah, we did. Thanks, Ant. Probably the first one that's come through is similar to the one you've just answered, but how do you get a CEO, senior management to jump on board with the culture change and live it?
Yeah, look, there's two elements there. So one's jumping on board and the other one's living it. So in order for someone to change, they need a motivation of change. They need the motivation to change, the knowledge of how to change, and an environment which supports that change. So understanding what's important to that CEO, understanding what their objectives are from a business perspective. And what we've had a little bit of success recently doing is actually sharing if you've got a particularly commercial CEO, one who's all focused on results and production and those sorts of elements, there's some really great case studies out there of the results of organizations getting safety right and the impact that that has had on production outcomes and organizational outcomes. And this is a funny thing with safety as a whole, and we've got a webinar coming up on positive safety. Safety itself tends to focus a lot on what doesn't work, the absence of harm, all this kind of negative things. But there's lots of interesting organizational examples out there of organizations who've actually done things incredibly well and got a very good result. You've got, and there's an Alcoa example within our masterclass that talks about Paul O'Neill, who used safety as one of the key levers to drive increased performance from Alcoa. You probably will have all have heard of Fukushima, and obviously the tsunami that cleaned up Fukushima and the disaster that occurred there. But Onagwa is another nuclear power plant that was actually closer to the epicenter of the earthquake in Japan when that disaster occurred. But because they'd done better planning and resourcing, they actually didn't have a disaster. They actually managed those circumstances. So perhaps flipping the conversation a little bit and looking at, what is it, not only taking that kind of fear-based approach, if we don't do this right, this is what's going to happen, but actually looking at organizations who are actually able to use safety and culture as a binding agent to increase performance might be another way to flip the conversation, start looking at things from a different lens.
Great. Next question we had come in was, how do you get leadership buy-in to recognise the importance of having a safety culture?
Yeah, good question. I think the way we would typically do that is, again, taking people through that individual stages of change model. You're building the motivation, giving the knowledge, creating the environment. I think when you get a bunch of people in an executive group, there will be a range of different attitudes and perceptions around safety. And it will often be the loudest people in the room, which probably have the greatest influence and say. A skilled facilitator with that group, so connecting some time to talk about, well, what's our vision for safety and what does it mean to us, is a really practical way to start creating a transformation process. So as a safety professional, I wouldn't actually be trying to tell anyone in that executive group anything. I'd be looking at, how do we create dissidence? How do we create an environment where leaders are challenging leaders and we're discussing some of these components. So again, a lot of the stuff that we do when we work with organizations at centers is we get people in a room, we find some common anchoring points around safety, and we actually create dissidence within the group so that we can actually get to so you've got a group that's challenging one another as opposed to us telling anyone anything in particular. So looking at, what's the value of safety from an individual, from an organizational, from a performance, from a brand perspective, getting people to share their own experiences around safety, why safety matters to them, creating space for that conversation, I think is one of the spaces that we possibly don't spend, and humanizing safety is possibly something that a lot of organizations don't spend enough time, particularly at the corporate levels, because they're so busy with other things.
Excellent. Next question is, how do you best lead change when working with resistance to a complacent culture and a complacent culture?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Cassie?
How do you best lead change when working with resistance and a complacent culture?
Yep. The planning process is so key. What's the data? Why are we getting the current results? What have you said and what are we going to do about it? Walk the talk and follow through and commit and celebrate those successes. And persisting. You will, there's a lot in safety that individuals do value and will value. A lot of that cynicism and resistance will be a perception that this is just another flash in a pan load of BS from management that's about covering their own backsides. We need to shift that perception. We need to challenge it. And the only way you're going to do that is through clear communications, follow through, and commitment from across the organisation.
Another one's just come in from Brad. How do you work on getting an organisation with a corporate face separate to the on-ground working face break down the barrier that the front-facing forces believe those in corporate side do not understand the on-ground needs workforce? Bit of a mouthful.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a very common challenge that we see where the perceptions of corporate are fairly negative from the workforce. It's a tricky one. I think so. The question is, how do you address that? Is that right, Cassie?
Yes. How do you work on getting them to kind of match up? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the first challenge is obviously having corporate accept that perception from the workforce. That will be something which isn't often readily accepted. And then, a lot of it is about humanizing that leader and getting more time in field connecting with the workforce. That's what people are saying when they give that feedback. They're saying, we want to talk to you, we want to see you, we want to hear from you. We want to be able to, we want you to understand how the decisions that you're making are influencing on your work every day. The typical resistance though you get when it comes to this is corporate's too busy. They got other things to do, and they got other, more pressing priorities. So it's a constant push and pull that we see. But I think spending that time in the field, creating that connection, there's some big opportunities for organisations to think strategically about how they do that.
And another one, in setting up a new site and organisation to run it, what would be the top 3 focus areas to achieve a positive safety culture in like the shortest time frame ever?
Vision, values and behaviours that match that vision, and a common language, and making sure that those things are bedded down from before the first shovel enters the ground. Having that leadership group aligned. This is the type of project we want. This is our vision. This is the way we're going to do things. This is the way we're going to behave. Yes, that alignment piece around the type of site and the type of operation that we've got, and then hiring, firing, making people decisions around those values and around that vision. It's funny, organisations that do that in the construction phase, you'll often see that same culture, either positive or negative, carry through to the operational side. So, a good leadership group who's tight and clear about what they're trying to achieve and aligned around that vision, that'll set the tone, probably arguably for that site for the rest of its life.
Perfect. And last question is, what are key considerations for implementation of a cultural transformation roadmap? Example, company safety reset.
Look, I think if things aren't going to plan and you're looking at basically taking a massive step change in performance, sometimes actually just acknowledging that, things aren't working. We've made mistakes, that like owning our 50% in things. If we want other people to own their 50% in things, we need to start by owning our 50% initially. So I think getting the current state out, warts and all, and having an open conversation with the workforce about that, as uncomfortable as it is, will be respected down the line, and does help the change process. Now, just going out there and saying, it's not working, and we're sorry, and these are mistakes we've made without a plan isn't going to help. So if you're going to do that, you need to be able to follow it through with, hey, yes, this is where we're at, this is what we're going to do about it, and then you got to follow through. And again, follow through and communicating that you're following through, absolutely crucial in any successful change. These processes aren't something that you get done in 3 months. You can get quite significant change in 6 months, but if you want to create that sustained change, you do need to be able to find a way to sustain the focus too.
Thank you very much. That is the last of our questions that have come up. I'd also like to just let everyone know our next webinar coming up is how to become a safety culture change agent, and that's on Thursday, the 16th of February. And look out for the invite to the psychosocial webinar that we will have coming up after that as well. Thank you very much for presenting, Anthony, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day, and until we see you next time, stay safe.
Thanks, Cassie. Just before we go, everyone, I do encourage you to particularly attend. Both those webinars are great. The psychosocial change agent one, the interplay between physical and psychosocial risk is so significant that's a webinar definitely not to be missed if you're working in particularly if you're working in a high risk heavy industry sector. So I encourage you to get in and have a look at that one as well in particular. But thank you for your time, everyone, and hopefully catch up again soon.